All right, folks, it's great to have you back for Lesson 11 in U.S. history. And as we are getting really close to closing out the year, we want to talk about one of the more important single events, certainly a defining event in American recent history, and kind of a good opportunity to really discuss how the Cold War occasionally would become a hot war. We saw that in Korea, and certainly the classic example is the war in Vietnam. The war in Vietnam is the longest war that the United States ever fought. It's also what most people would consider to be, at best, a draw, at worst, a loss for the United States. So how did this little nation that most people could never find on a map before the war bring down one of the most powerful giants of the Cold War era? Well, we're going to take a look, and you're going to see that there was a lot of very small things that occurred that led the United States to the Vietnamese War and ultimately to the demise of the government that the U.S. backed, and ultimately the U.S. leaving Vietnam. So let's take a little look at back at history and see how this came to pass. In September of 1945, after the Americans and the Allies beat the Japanese left Vietnam. Prior to the Japanese taking over Vietnam, the French had controlled Vietnam as a colonial power. But now, the nationalist leader of Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh, felt that he had an opportunity to have his country become independent. And he wanted to do that based on the United States doctrine. He used words as he spoke about his new country directly from the U.S. independence. And he was congratulated by the U.S. representatives who were on hand for the occasion of him talking about the independence of his country. However, within about 20 years of this date, the U.S. and Ho Chi Minh and his North Vietnamese army were bitter enemies locked in a brutal war. So the question really is, how did this happen? So let's walk through and see what occurred in Vietnam that led to this. A little bit of background. Up until World War II, Vietnam, which is outlined on the map here, was a French colony. During World War II, the Japanese controlled Vietnam, as they did all of this part of the world called Indochina, and then ultimately were kicked out. The Viet Minh, which was an independence group, a group that wanted to control Vietnam as its own country, in 1941 they start to look for U.S. support. However, based on some decisions that were made, they moved to a communist ideal in the 1950s. And that really was because the French decided after World War II that they wanted this colony back. They wanted it back because of the production of rubber and rubber plants for tires. And so they needed this for the raw materials. They wanted it back. The U.S. supported the French in having the colony back because we needed French help in the Cold War. So all these little events are leading to Vietnam, which once was going to be potentially positive towards the United States, now developing as a communist nation. So the Viet Minh take up arms against the French, who try to reestablish their colonial control. And from about 1946 to 1954, we have a battle, a civil war going on between the colonial powers, the French, and the Viet Minh. The Viet Minh, this group of national leaders again in Vietnam, beat the French decisively at a battle called Dien Bien Phu. And the French ultimately decide they can't sustain this effort, and they're going to leave. And so there's a peace treaty, and it splits the country into North Vietnam and South Vietnam at the 17th parallel, with the idea that in 1956 there would be countrywide elections to decide on a single government for the entire country. So let's look at the two different sides we have here, North Vietnam and South Vietnam. North Vietnam is a communist government. It's led by Ho Chi Minh, who was that leader we talked about earlier that actually was very pro-U.S. until the U.S. refused to back him. And he is backed by the Soviet Union and China, so certainly the American enemies during the Cold War. They have an experienced army, an army that has fought against the Japanese and fought against the French, and they support something called the Viet Cong group. So we have a lot of terminology here. Viet Minh are these soldiers that are fighting for independence. The Viet Cong are communist guerrilla fighters in South Vietnam. Okay, South Vietnam, which we're going to talk about in a minute, is their government is being fought by these particular people called the Viet Cong. So let's take a look at South Vietnam. South Vietnam is ostensibly a democratic government. It's backed by the United States, but it's a very, very corrupt government. It's led by President Diem, who is an aristocrat, comes from a very, very wealthy family, but has very little connection with the people. The people don't like him and they don't trust him. As I said, it's a corrupt government. The government has a Catholic bias. Diem is a Catholic, and the Buddhists, which are the predominant religion in the area, are frustrated by this. And they have an army, but it's a very unreliable army of conscripts, meaning that people went out and grabbed young men to serve as soldiers, and it's called the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, or ARVN for short. And this is the side that the United States is backing. So what happens as we're leading up to the war? Well, the U.S., of course, we've talked about this before, is there because of the domino theory. The U.S. is very concerned and nervous that North Vietnam, which is a communist government, will ultimately take over South Vietnam, and all of a sudden we have a communist government in this region of the world, and we're starting to have that slippery slope again. So, in 1961, we send in some advisors, and this is in quotations, to assist the South Vietnamese army. There's about 900 of them. By 1963, we have about 16,000 advisors, and some of these are actually serving troops that are fighting alongside the ARVN. By 1964, we have 27,000 advisors, and we're actually starting to have some covert raids where we're actually going from the south of Vietnam into the north of Vietnam. At the same time, in the south, and that's what this picture dictates here, and it's pretty brutal, I appreciate that, but it really is to show that there was a lot of protests against the government in South Vietnam. The people did not back the South Vietnamese government and protested against them. In 1964, in August, there was an event that occurred that allowed the United States to become more involved in the war, and it was called the Gulf of Tonkin incident. And supposedly on the 2nd and 4th of August, two U.S. destroyers, were fired on by North Vietnamese gunships. Based on that, Lyndon Baines Johnson, our president, sends something called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution to Congress on August the 5th, which really allows for war against North Vietnam. And that begins this whole process of ramping up the number of soldiers that are serving there, ramping up the number of bombs that are dropped, based on the fact that LBJ says there's been aggression against the United States. The tricky part, it was never able to be confirmed that there actually were two destroyers, U.S. destroyers, that were fired upon. It's really sketchy. And so a lot of people look at this as an opportunity for the U.S. to have an excuse to go to war. Others say no, the U.S. was protecting its interests and had to go to war. But that's really what led to the change from advisors to troops on the ground. But before troops get there, we essentially are going to try to soften up North Vietnam by something called Operation Rolling Thunder. And this is a campaign that really goes from March of 1965 to October of 1968. And it was based on bombing strict targets within North Vietnam. And the Air Force is involved, as is the Navy. And you can see a picture here of an Air Force B-52 dropping bombs on North Vietnam. But we also saw a heavy loss of U.S. pilots. And so, as we were looking at the presidential campaign a couple of years ago, and we talked about John McCain being a person who was a prisoner of war in Vietnam, this is what he was involved in and was shot down. And it really failed to weaken the North Vietnamese resolve. They still kept fighting, and even though more bombs were dropped during this operation on North Vietnam than were dropped in all of World War II, it did not get ultimately what we wanted, which was to soften up the North Vietnamese. So ultimately we're going to have to send troops in, put boots on the ground, and we'll see how that presents itself next.